first.
Okay, my presentation is on ISIS, which is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. They originally called it just IS, which is the Islamic State, and they were actually created in the early 2000s, during the beginning in around 2004, 2005 of the Iraq War. And their original leader was a man named al-Zakari, and he was actually responsible for some of the most brutal attacks in Iraq at the time against coalition forces and against Iraqi civilians. At that time, we had put out, he became, after Saddam was captured and his lieutenants were captured, when the insurgency started, he became our #1 target. He was killed in 2006 in an airstrike after we had gathered intelligence on him and when he was meeting with his religious leader. Around 2007, there was a major push called the Surge, which was called the Surge in Iraq, that was supposed to help squash the insurgencies that were going on. And I forgot how many troops were added to the war zone, but by us pushing all our new troops in there, new combat troops, it forced the Islamic State into Syria, across the border into Syria. We ended up pushing them out of Iraq. Once they came into Syria, they became involved in the Syrian Civil War, which was starting up at the time. And at that point, their new leader was a man named al-Baghdadi, which he's still the current leader. They joined forces with the Taliban and, with Al-Qaeda and another group called the Nusra Front in Syria. And they began committing a lot of atrocities in Syria, to the point where actually Al-Qaeda decided to distance themselves from the Islamic State. And at that point, that's pretty rare to happen, to have a group like Al-Qaeda, who's done beheadings and all that stuff, to actually realize these people are too out of control and distance themselves from that. So that was kind of a foreshadowing of what was gonna happen. But they ended up, the Nusra Front ended up creating an alliance with the Islamic State, and that's when it became the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. At that point, it was around 2011, and we had started the drawdown of U.S. forces in Iraq. When that happened, ISIS decided it was time to go back into Iraq. And that's why, and when they flooded back into Iraq, is when they started all the mass executions up in the Sinjar area where I was actually deployed. Okay, once they were back in Iraq, they started mass executions and started basically a blitzkrieg. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with what that is. It's what was called the Germans' tactics in World War II, where they just flooded the area with as many forces as possible, as fast as possible, to defeat people. And at that time, since we had some residual combat troops left in Iraq to help support the Iraqi army, they buckled very quickly. A lot of them threw down their weapons and tore off their uniforms and fled. And that's why now ISIS controls large parts of northern Iraq and Syria. In order to do things like that, to have all these battles going on and take control of massive swaths of land, you have to have a lot of funding. And ISIS actually has one of the largest amounts of money of any terrorist group to control, to be able to launch these operations. They have over $2 billion in funds. A lot of their funding actually comes from rich and religiously connected Saudi donors and people in the Gulf states, mainly. One of their major donors, I can't pronounce his name, but this guy, he was a former minister of Islamic affairs in Kuwait. His whole family is pretty much involved with that. Other sources of funding, they started raiding the oil fields. And so now while they can't sell the oil on the national market because nobody will buy it from ISIS, they can do it in their own countries. The way they have gas stations and stuff set up in Iraq, it's basically a tent on the side of the road that they sell all this stuff from. That's how they get a lot of their funding. And they actually started robbing banks too. When they took over Mosul in Iraq earlier this year, they robbed a bank for I think $340 million in Mosul. They just looted all the money. They've also started extorting people. You can't see the rest of this, but They force them to pay protection taxes and businesses, otherwise they won't be allowed to sell their goods, or they'll be targeted if they don't pay for protection. Their goals have pretty much became to create an Islamic State, where it's a country ran by religious leaders that all fall under the al-Baghdadi, which is they consider the supreme leader. They want to rid all non-Muslims, or as they call them, infidels, out of all Islamic lands. And that's the justification they're using for these mass executions. They believe anyone who doesn't fall, even other Muslims that don't fall in line with their goals, are considered non-believers and infidels. Even though they're Muslims and they practice, Islam, they kill them. And that's their justification for that. They believe, even children. I don't know if you guys have seen the pictures, but they behead kids too. It's absurd. They believe that Allah is the only true God, and every other religion believes in false prophets. That's also why they deserve to be executed according to them. Their ideology is they follow an extreme interpretation of Islam. It's basically the ancient understanding of Islam. They take the Quran, for example, they take it word for word. And that's how they justify their violence. And they adhere to strict, I can't pronounce that very well either, Sharia law, which is religious law basically that actually states, what women can wear, things of that nature. And if you violate that, they actually have their own jails set up. They've actually done, this is going to sound bad to say, but a very good job of basically setting up the same sort of institutions that any government requires. They have jails, they have courts, and not everyone's killed, but like when someone violates Sharia law, they take them to jail, and they put them in jail until they go in front of a religious trial, and then that's when their fate is decided. It usually results in death, even for the slightest offenses, or cutting off of the hands, the whippings, things of that nature. Like I said, anyone they think is a non-believer should be punished by death. They've committed such things as genocide, massacring thousands of people just based off their different religions. For example, the place I was deployed at was Sinjar up in northern Iraq, and like I said, that was one of the first places they came to. The tribes that live in that area are called the Yazidis, and they're actually Christians. And when they came back into Iraq, they slaughtered them by the thousands. Just killed them left and right, and kidnapped their women, because they believe since they're not true Muslims, that their women can be taken as sex slaves. And then they're used up and sold into the sex trade. And then in my opinion, I put on probably the best way to stop ISIS, up in the north, where the majority of the Kurdish Iraqis are, is a fighting group called the Peshmerga. We worked with them a lot when the U.S. was still in Iraq. They have a lot of the same ideas as us. They wanted to get rid of Saddam just like we did. And they're actually a very good fighting force. Anytime ISIS has gone up against a traditional fighting force, such as the Peshmerga, or some of the other countries that have sent units into these places, they've lost horribly. That's the only way they've been able to win ground, was because they would swarm untrained people, such as the Iraqi army, who didn't have very good training and weren't committed to it, and they would flee. But anytime someone stepped up and actually fought them head to head, ISIS loses. Because their goal is to die. They actually look forward to death, because they believe they're going to paradise where they're going to get 72 virgins, and so on. But I believe that we need to actually start supporting the Peshmerga more. The Peshmerga have never done anything to us like a lot of these other groups that are trying to stop ISIS are actually the same groups that were fighting us at the time too, but not the Peshmerga. We need to support their local fighters. We need to start providing better weapons to at least that group, not a lot of the other groups, because a lot of the other groups, as soon as they're done fighting ISIS, they're going to turn around and use them against us, which has happened before. And regional powers such as Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel, the other countries that are in the immediate area that have ISIS as an immediate threat to them, they need to step up and be more proactive, because it's them that's going to be affected the most if ISIS is allowed to continue. And finally, world powers need to provide the support and participate militarily to the local and regional coalition fighting ISIS. Because some of these countries are poor and don't have the updated equipment to best serve them, and if we help them out, ultimately it benefits us. That's pretty much it. So that's all I got.
I apologize, guys. I felt like I lost it a little bit. So anyway, I'm apologize for that. I didn't. Sorry. I really apologize for that. Oh wow.